Welcome to the Cloud Pod, where the forecast is always cloudy. We talk weekly about all things AWS, Google, and Azure. We are your hosts,
Justin,
Jonathan,
and Peter.
Episode 21, recorded on April 30th. The Cloud Pod exceeds quarterly listener expectations. Good afternoon on this final day of April. How's it going, everybody?
Hey, going all right?
Hey, Justin. How are you?
It's going really well. It sounds like a little under the weather today, Peter.
Yeah, I hope I don't sound too stuffy, but finally caught up to me.
Great. Well, I do have a guest for us this week. I'd like to introduce Ian McKay, if you'd like to say a few words. He's coming live to us from the Amazon Summit in Sydney, Australia.
Hi everyone, Ian McKay here. I come from Sydney, Australia. Today I'm at the Sydney Summit. We're recording this the day after Innovation Day, but the day before the first day of Summit. So it's pretty good so far. You get a bit of robotics action going on and some talks from some local businesses that's doing cool stuff in cloud.
Awesome. Yeah, we had ours here in Santa Clara a few weeks ago, and it was always a good time as always, and it's good to see a few announcements at some of these summits, and it is only midway through summit season, so the summits are continuing in a big way. All right, well, let's get into a quick bit of follow-up. So last week we talked about Apple and Apple's usage of Amazon Web Services, apparently to the tune of $30 million a month. Reports came out after those articles broke that that's actually a reduction. Apparently, in 2017, Apple spent $775 million in Amazon spend, and that's actually, they've cut it down in half. Apparently, this is all driven by Apple's desire to reduce their reliance on third-party vendors, and they're planning to spend over $10 billion in data centers over the next 5 years. So a pretty huge investment on them. So that's, that $30 million a month is a chump change compared to the amount of money they're spending on data centers right now.
Wow, I wonder if they're going to move into the hyperscaler space and start offering their own services. That's a lot of money to spend just for their own infrastructure.
I mean, it's probably if they're investing in actual data centers, they're amortizing that over 20, 30 years. If it's just hardware, it's still 5 years, so probably shrinks pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, apparently there was an issue where they were providing data onto Google's infrastructure, and they were told, that their data wasn't going to a certain data center. Then that data center apparently caught on fire, and they found out that their data was not where it was supposed to be. So Apple, in their interest of privacy, is definitely interested in reducing some of their resilience on the cloud providers. But they still are hiring a lot of people in the cloud. It's like they're still doing a lot of investment there, but it's like they're going to try to go for a really strong hybrid play that allows them to maintain their privacy requirements as well as their data sovereignty as needed.
I think they'd want to obviously own their own infrastructure to a certain degree, but also, build that system where they could be zero trust with those partners and still leverage their services.
Yep, it'll be interesting to see what they do. And I would love for them to come out with a cloud service to do things like iOS builds. Because right now, that's not something you can run on AWS or Google or anybody else. iOS builds are very particular to Apple hardware. So I wouldn't mind being able to get that from a cloud provider. All right, let's move on to the news this week. So the first story out of the gate is Ford has apparently partnered with Amazon to build cloud service connected cars. This is a new cloud-based service built by their partner Autonomic, and this will be hosting the Transportation Mobility Cloud. This is a system designed to be used by any brand of cars. It is agnostic to allow them to handle telemetry, cloud image data, communicate with each other, and just overall improve the autonomous vehicle industry. Andy Jassy said on this, the collaboration with Ford and Autonomic transforms the way automotive consumers and partners develop connected vehicle cloud services.
If you say so. It seems like everybody's starting up a autonomous car business right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because Amazon also mentioned this. They did a partnership with VW sometime a couple months back. I think we talked about it briefly on the show as well. So, Amazon, I think, is just becoming the platform that all these companies are using for IoT and connected devices. And the legacy automakers are all excited about announcing partnerships with Amazon and this new platform that really has no adoption yet.
Since its partnership with Ford, they're going to write it in Rust.
Oh.
Very nice.
I think it's definitely a play that Amazon have been looking for a while. They've had reference architectures for connected vehicle solutions for a while, and this is exactly what they wanted.
And now they got the satellite infrastructure too. Well, they're going to launch the satellite infrastructure too for which could be the endpoint for all these ground stations. Wouldn't even need to rely on cellular data anymore, which right now is kind of a requirement for any of the autonomous vehicles.
Amazon has announced a new cost management blog. They posted their first Hello World post this week by Aaron Carlson, Product Marketing Manager for AWS Billing and Cost Management. The first blog post itself covers key organizational transformations that your organization will most likely go through, including adjusting to pay-as-you-go pricing, decentralized resource procurement, and breadth of functionality of a cloud provider. I think the big thing that was interesting to me about this post and why it's here and on the lightning round is actually the fact that Amazon continues to have costs as their biggest challenge with customers. It's the biggest complaint in the market. And so giving themselves a soapbox to sign on and kind of talk about what they're doing and how they're trying to help customers can help counteract some of this negative press that they're seeing from people like Apple and Snapchat and Pinterest who are spending tons of money on AWS. This now gives them a chance to maybe respond to some of that feedback or to educate the market further, which is an area that I think Amazon, while they have great resources internally, they don't really talk publicly that often. And they've left that to people like Corey Quinn, who have added their own flavor of snark to the process, which is great. But Amazon really needed a more public face to cost management. I think this is an interesting play by them.
It's obvious that, seeing how lots of people use the AWS cloud infrastructure, that the biggest problem is usually education and people who are really upset with the pricing. It's not that I'm saying Amazon is the cheapest way to go all the time, but usually the big cost pain is doing things wrong on Amazon. And then this often misperception in the market that just because the numbers are big, it means it's expensive on a per unit basis. So I just educate the market, time to educate the market, get people to use the platform more effectively, and also educate people on the whole model. I think it's great.
Yeah, I think Corey Quinn had a field day when this announcement came out. He goes on to say a lot about how people are using big analytical solutions just to read the costs in people's accounts, and some of the biggest vendors, ISVs that are out there are cost management solutions. So it's probably a step in the right direction, but there's a long way to go there.
There's a new query for AWS regions, endpoints, and more using Amazon Systems Manager parameter store. This apparently was an ask by AWS customers to have a method to detect things like regional endpoints, available services in any given region, and an ability for their applications on launch to basically query this data through parameter store and use it to configure different services for their applications. So this is an interesting use of the parameter store beyond secrets and some of the other things that people do with certificates. But now you can query those Amazon services and know what environment that you're living in.
Yeah, it's pulled my hair out so many times when you're doing automation and endpoint names are a little bit inconsistent in convention between services. When you're referring to regions, what actual convention is used for that. I think this is awesome. I think it's going to make everyone's lives a lot easier from an automation standpoint. I was just surprised it's not just a normal API call and that it is built into the Systems Manager parameter store. But I think anywhere is having this is a good thing.
I mean, I think it doesn't fit into the metadata service, which is why they thought about putting it into something like parameter store. But yeah, it is an interesting choice that it's not just an API.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the SDKs have had this feature for a while, but it's not well known about, and it can quickly become stale if you're running old versions of the SDKs.
Yeah, I don't think the SDKs, though, were dynamic either. I think they were very... they had the endpoints in their data in the SDK, but they didn't necessarily know dynamically if they were changing. And this potentially allows the SDKs to get simpler too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is weird that they didn't just make it a regular call. I mean, you already have describe for so many other things. Why not just describe services?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bizarre. Maybe they just want to encourage more use of the parameter store.
Well, and I think it also, in some cases, you mentioned a few episodes ago about the metadata service is somewhat, doesn't have a lot of security to it. So for a customer who's really concerned, they maybe don't want to have the entire CLI or SDK installed on the system if they only need one parameter. So this is maybe a nice way to kind of get away from that overhead of a much larger deployment system, or even if you think about containers where you maybe don't want to have that CLI commands or SDK commands there. This is a nice option. So I see the use cases. I think it's still to be seen what people do with it, but I definitely think there's potential for it.
I wonder if it's because they see the potential for people to use this at a very high rate, and they don't want people to get throttled with their standard API calls. And so by putting it in a parameter store, Amazon can charge for it, which means you could use as much as you would like, which is nice, actually, from my perspective, because nothing worse than having a service that you can't buy more of, like API calls.
Yeah, it's very true. We get away from API limits, too. That's a good call out.
It's almost Amazon's own metadata about their own services, so maybe they're going to expand the use of the parameter store to keep more information about their own services in there. I mean, maybe they can put uptime in there and or service availability. I think we'll see more of this. I think this is a sign that we're going to see more of this kind of thing.
Maybe they can move tagging to parameter store.
Yeah, exactly. And something I asked for a long time ago was the ability to store metadata about my accounts in the account somewhere. I mean, you can't tag an account, so maybe this is going to be their solution. Keep it in the parameter store.
Well, and it definitely solves some of the confusion we were seeing too between Systems Manager parameters and Secrets Manager too. Like, this is a much more robust service than just secrets, but it has a different use case, and potentially these secrets aren't secret. They're just things you need to know.
Yep.
All right. Well, it's Peter's favorite time of the year. It's earnings season, as usual. And we luckily recorded this in time for all three of them to announce their earnings before our next recording. So let's start with Microsoft, who started the earnings season this year. They posted $30.6 billion in revenue powered by their cloud division. They rebounded from a rare revenue miss in Q2, exceeding Wall Street expectations for its third quarter. This revenues of $30.6 billion is up 14% from the same quarter a year ago. And cloud revenue reportedly was up 22% to $9.7 billion, powered by 73% annual revenue growth in their cloud business. So that is big growth for the number 2 player in the cloud space.
I just can't help but wish we could see the Azure number instead of the cloud revenue number.
Yeah, I wish it was lumped in with Office 365 and Server and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, real interesting.
Hey everyone, Jonathan here. I just wanted to take a minute to thank the cloud consulting gurus at Foghorn for helping make the Cloud Pod possible. These folks truly get it. Cloud consulting experts since 2008, they are premier tier partners with AWS, Google Cloud Platform Silver, and Microsoft Azure partners. From multi-cloud to containers to moving full production workloads to the cloud under the tightest compliance, Foghorn's team of full-stack cloud engineers have been there, done that, gotten the t-shirt, and are ready to share their experience with you. If you're in the market for some talent to supplement your team, visit www.fogops.io/thecloudpod. www.fogops.io/thecloudpod. Foghorn, the promise of cloud delivered.
Amazon revenue then followed up Microsoft with they're apparently approaching $8 billion in Amazon revenue in the first quarter, up 41% compared to the prior quarter last year. Income was up $2.2 billion as well, up 55% from last year. And AWS growth basically represents a continued 40% increase year over year. Margins were steady thanks to improved efficiencies inside AWS data centers, CFO Brian Olszewski said. Every percentage utilization gain in our data centers worth tens of millions of dollars, he said. Very interesting money quote from their earnings.
Wow, that's a huge amount.
Yeah, and at that size of a business that they're still growing at 40%. Annualizes. I mean, that's what it should look like. That's what a booming industry should look like.
Well, and if you think about some of the statistics that were coming out a couple of weeks ago about the cloud market, they're saying they've only penetrated enterprise IT at 10% of the market. So there's still 90% of the market still left to be tapped into by these 3 players, and that's just a huge amount of growth that they all have still available to them.
And it's coming from somewhere. Where is it coming from? So it's coming at somebody else's loss. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, definitely someone else is impacted. Maybe we'll talk about them a little later.
Yeah, I know the next couple of years with opening more data centers in more remote parts of the world as well, which I don't see Microsoft doing. They're going to soak up a bunch more business.
Yeah, definitely. Microsoft has a lot more domestic regions than AWS has. And then, of course, Alphabet finished up the earnings season on Monday with a pretty... they had a lot of problems in their earnings. They don't break out cloud revenue, so we won't be able to talk really about a lot of that. But basically, they had slowing revenue growth heading into this quarter. Profit of $6.6 billion or $9.50 a share. Down from $13.33 a share a year ago. They did point out, though, that they did have a $1.7 billion EU fine that reduced them from $11.50 a share to that $9.50 a share. Revenue rose 17%, but was overall slower due to Google product changes, industry lull in ad and marketing spend, and changes in YouTube ad systems. Their other revenues, which does include the cloud, did have a revenue rise of 25%, up to $5.45 billion. And the CFO stated that the cloud is the third major driver of revenue growth behind mobile search ads and YouTube ads. But analysts expected that to be $5.67 billion. So overall, they definitely had a big miss. Cloud is also apparently leading to the overall company growth and headcount, both in engineering and in sales. So they're making large investments in both those areas to catch up. But not as great for Google or Alphabet company as the other two. But definitely still showing some growth in their cloud market, which is good.
And that 5.45 billion is other revenues. I mean, there's so much tied up, and I'm dying to know what the real number is.
Oh, I assume it's half or a quarter of it actually, based on what's in that group. But I mean, for only being in the market really as a serious contender to both AWS and Azure, it's not a bad place to be. But they definitely need to pick up the pace, which is why I think they have that growth in both engineering and sales headcount. AMD Epic powered Amazon EC2 T38 instances have been launched. This is very similar to the current Intel based T3 instances. They are built on the Nitro system. They use the same burstable mode with reservation credits, etc. But with the AMD processor, you can save up to 10% on your monthly bill compared to the comparable Intel units.
Who doesn't want a 10% cut? I imagine there's going to be huge demand for these things, especially as these T3s are the kind of instances that just get deployed by the hundreds in people's accounts.
I mean, I still have an issue with the 10% because, again, it doesn't necessarily represent equal performance. You may actually see a degradation in performance greater than 10%. So you still need to test your instances and really make sure that they meet what you require. But, for teams that can use these T3s and they like the burstability of them, that 10% may be a big number when you talk about the hundreds or thousands of these units you're deploying at any given time. So it's definitely, there's a market for it. I just don't know that it's exactly a 10% wash that you need to kind of do the math.
Just speaking of testing your instances, it's probably worth noting that a lot of these regions don't have full coverage for these T3A instances. So you might find that they're in one or two of your three availability zones. So just something to watch out for. Yeah,
they're definitely being rolled out pretty slowly across the different regions. And if you're not in one of the main US regions, definitely check your console and your APIs before you move on to to using them.
Did the parameter store contain this kind of information, or did they not go into EC2 instance types? I know I had services, but I didn't know if it was more detailed than just EC2.
Wow, that's a good question.
Yeah. I think it did. If I remember in the examples, they showed that particular use case as an example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's hugely valuable, right? When we're automating the spin up of things in different regions, but not knowing what instances are available.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, I can definitely see a use for this now, for the parameter store now.
Yeah, I mean, so many workloads are, people are looking for I need a couple CPUs, I need X amount of RAM, and no one's doing any performance evaluation at all. They just need the box there. So I can see tons of people moving over to the A instances and chopping their bill and probably not hearing a word from their internal customers who requested the provisioning of the box.
Yeah, I mean, the network performance on these T3 instances and even the T2s is not the best. And so I don't know anyone would actually use these things in production for any kind of heavy-duty workload. And so I don't know. I'd be curious to see if anyone is actually using these things in production. I assumed that they were more a development phase kind of thing. And so who really cares about performance at that level?
Well, your performance engineering team probably does.
They should be testing on the production configuration.
Apparently over in Ian's neck of the wood, we have a new Amazon region. The new Asia-Pacific Hong Kong region is now open for business. This is the 8th region in Asia-Pacific. With this launch, AWS now has over 64 availability zones within 21 global geographic regions. This is just one of many regions that's going online the next few years. We talked about Jakarta a few weeks ago, but there's still Bahrain coming, Cape Town, and Milan all on the docket to be launched the next few years. So big growth in the data center space. It looks like most of the main services, the core EC2 services, are available to you, except for Beanstalk, Kubernetes, and X-Ray will be available sometime in the next month. And this is the very first region to utilize the new opt-in methodology for regions we talked about a few weeks ago on the show. This now basically requires you to enable the region in IAM. This apparently had some interesting side effects on the internet, as many people were complaining about their API calls that didn't expect to see, basically these weird error messages were not being handled properly. And so there's definitely some teething pains with the new APIs and the new IAM region stuff that may impact your scripts. So if you had something break sometime in the last week as they launch this region, it's probably tied maybe to this change in the APIs.
Yeah, I had quite a few experiments with this. I think the initial activation time is about 1 to 2 hours in my experience. And that's the service creating its own default VPCs and default security groups and that sort of thing. But to toggle off and on, that's a pretty instantaneous process after that point. So it's interesting to see this new methodology of region activation coming in.
Yeah, hopefully they'll kind of smooth it out a little bit so that in the future they, it's now a known error condition and you make the error message actually say, region not enabled versus failing in the really opaque ways it has failed. It's interesting though that, it doesn't, on the first time you end up provisioning up a bunch of default settings, but then after that it kind of reverts back to just toggle on off. I wonder why they didn't just choose to deploy those resources anyways and then toggle them off to fix that speed problem in the initial launch.
So does the Hong Kong region still sit behind the Great Chinese Firewall, or is it still considered outside China?
No, it's considered a commercial region. So if you notice the actual short name of it, it's AP East 1, I believe, and not CN South 1. So it kind of shows where they're playing that sort of dice.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm kind of surprised they would have to do that, actually. It's been a lot of years since China took control over Hong Kong again. Well, excellent, because I know a lot of people who've been waiting for something in that region of the world, so this is kind of exciting.
All right. Slack apparently has renegotiated its deal with Amazon in 2018, but will still continue to spend about $212 million more with them through 2023. This all coming from the new S1 filing for Slack. Slack disclosed it signed a new 5-year deal with AWS with annual commitment to spend a minimum of $50 million a year on cloud services. Of course, the article said that they most likely did this to lock in discounting and pricing, which is the obvious reason to do this. And Slack is apparently all in on AWS and does not use other cloud providers. And more interestingly, they are a very US-centric server presence, not really using a lot of international regions, which we think would be somewhat of a problem for them tapping into European or Asian markets that require data for privacy reasons to be in that country. But interesting things from the S1 filing. It's good to see these unicorns disclosing what their Amazon investments are and what they're doing in the cloud. I think it's pretty interesting.
There's still time for somebody to buy them. There's still time. Microsoft could still swoop in.
They could. They did call out Microsoft as their biggest and only competitor in their S1 filing. I didn't notice that for you, but I don't know if even if Microsoft wanted to buy them, I don't know that the Justice Department would let them if they're considered to be the biggest competitor.
We have to concede that point.
It's not WebEx, huh?
There are other players who'd be interested in owning this technology, like Cisco, in particular, comes to mind that would be interesting. But so far, no acquires, Jonathan. I think it's going public before it gets bought.
Is Slack as popular in Australia, Ian, as it is here in the US?
Incredibly, it's so far out there. There's a very minor subset of people using MS Teams, but Slack is the dominant provider here.
It was interesting to me, though, that in their, in the S1, you find out that only 17% of the Slack workspaces that exist are actually paid for, which I feel like if they lowered their prices, they would probably get that number doubled or tripled, if not farther than that, because the pricing is the biggest blocker for most enterprises to adopt Slack. It's ridiculously expensive for what it is and what you're getting. And I wonder if they really thought that pricing model through. Like, they could probably get way more volume and you would definitely lower their margins, but they'd have way more volume and make it up there.
Are you referring to just the standard Slack paid model or like enterprise pricing?
All of them.
I don't mind the standard one. For our company, I think it's one of the best bang for bucks we get out of a tool. I mean, if you add in all of the free users that you get, I think it's pretty reasonable. I think the enterprise one, I've heard it gets pretty pricey pretty quick.
It does. But I mean, when you compare it to their biggest competitor before, which was HipChat, which was charging you $2 a user per month per year, and now Microsoft Teams, which is free if you have an Office 365 subscription that you probably already have, it makes it a little bit harder to justify the cost of Slack in an organization like that. And I think the enterprise features that are very expensive are needed by a lot of security teams.
Right.
And so I think it's definitely something I think they need to look at, but they're probably not going to. They have 70% of their market. They have revenues to support this model, but I definitely feel like they could make it up in margin if they lowered the price.
Right.
Docker Hub apparently was exposed in a breach. 190,000 accounts have been leaked. They have reached out to you if you were impacted by the database breach, and you should be changing your passwords and rolling your access keys, as they cannot guarantee that those access keys were not compromised and or used to build potentially suspect containers. This is definitely something to be taken pretty seriously. This happened on the 25th of April, and so if you have not yet changed your password, I would recommend strongly you go do that as soon as possible. They did not get financial data, so any credit cards or anything you're using to handle your Docker enterprise subscriptions, but definitely all of your container builds, your container build runtimes that are public, those were potentially exposed.
And the worst thing about this is that potentially had access to your API keys for GitHub, for public, for your private GitHub repos. So if those keys were stolen, then potentially your intellectual property could be stolen, or a risk at least. So make sure to rotate the GitHub machine keys as well.
Microsoft also did update on this as well. They are indicating that their images on Docker Hub are safe if you're using them, the .NET Core or any of the Windows images. But they did recommend that you still move over to Microsoft's new container registry. They are only maintaining the Docker Hub images for backwards compatibility, but they have moved away from Docker Hub as their main deployment model. So it's something to keep in mind if you're using the Azure platform for your containers or things like that. You might think about moving to MCR for this use case in the future.
I think it's a very scary thing. If I was a hacker, the first thing I would do is upload my own Ubuntu or Alpine image, which is just going to cover at least 50% of that entire market of Docker containers. And it's definitely going to spur that conversation about using MCR, ECR, GCR, and those private container registries more seriously.
Well, it definitely exposes something that I don't think a lot of people have really been thinking about, which is that if you're putting your Git credentials into a third-party SaaS and that gets compromised, now they have access to your source code. That's a risk factor that, I think some companies have been thinking about and really talking about, but not all. And especially even in the case where, they're using a GitHub Enterprise on-premise, if they still have anything plumbed to one of these public services that accesses GitHub, that could be a risk that definitely needs to be considered in the future.
Yeah, just think how many builds they do, and just think how many... just think how quickly a compromised image could affect people globally. I mean, it's pretty scary.
So yesterday at Dell's annual user conference, which I didn't realize they had an annual user conference, they have announced their new partnership between VMware and Microsoft Azure. This new deal involves the launch of software bundle dubbed Azure VMware Solutions. It includes 4 components: the vSphere hypervisor, vSAN storage management, the NSX network management, and vCenter control tier. This is very similar to the partnership that was done by AWS several years ago with VMware. But the big interesting thing about this is that this was always seen as kind of the never going to happen solution because of Microsoft's competitive product Hyper-V, which competes directly with the VMware stack. So this is Microsoft being the new Microsoft of the Satya versus Steve, and being willing to work with their partners and make the right solutions for their customers. This partnership also includes a couple extra things, including Horizon Cloud virtual desktops to be used with Windows Virtual Desktop Service from Azure, as well as Dell will be adding in Active Directory connectors for some of its Workspace ONE suite of tools.
Yeah, I mean, that whole concept of not giving the customers what they want because it makes strategic sense for your business usually only works when your customers have no other options. Clearly, customers have other options. So this to me is a no-brainer, and it's hugely valuable. Like see, a lot of the customers who are considering and are integrating Azure, are all on VMware right now. They are not all on Hyper-V. And so this could really accelerate that pickup of Azure workloads.
I just still think it's interesting how much the hyperscalers are getting into bed with VMware in general. I mean, all these companies could destroy VMware so easily, and yeah, now we're partnering with the enemy who is really holding us back from moving to public cloud in a big way. It's kind of interesting, but I definitely know some people who are using this technology and like it a lot. I don't. I would just rather replatform to cloud natively if it was me. But
I just see it as a migration strategy. So I can. If there ends up being 15% of the stuff left in my data center, I don't have to keep my data center open. Just move it all, close the data center, and then replatform later.
I don't know. It's interesting choice, right? Because you're paying for VMware to basically deploy and maintain your VMs on cloud, which doesn't get your corporation moving towards cloud native, doesn't get your culture better. And then, if you want to start, at least in the Amazon case, and I don't know how it's working on Azure, but in the Amazon case, if you want to access something like RDS or DynamoDB, you end up having to create a different account and then peer it to the VMware account. So while it is still very similar, it is the cloud, it's not cloud native, it's not the culture of cloud, it's not any of the other benefits you get with it, and you're still paying VMware a ton of money to support it. It's a tough one for me to see the value of.
Yeah, the lack of the metadata endpoint inside the VMs on AWS was just ends the whole game round.
Yeah,
there's no point using it.
That is pretty brutal. But if it's only for 10% of your workloads and it allows you to close the doors in your data center, it may be worth it.
I guess it's cheaper than signing up for a new 12 or 24 month lease with CenturyLink or Equinix or somebody else. If it comes down to the last few days of your lease and you didn't quite get everything out, then yeah.
I mean, even look at Amazon, right? How long did it take them to get off of Oracle? Mm-hmm. It took them 10 years?
Yeah.
So, but that was just one tiny piece, right? So I could see lots of workloads getting sort of stuck, but that VMware footprint becoming smaller and smaller as a percentage of your whole workload.
I'm sure VMware see this as great. We can still get some revenue as people migrate to the cloud. It kind of extends the life of the company a little bit, and AWS and Microsoft probably think of it more like the gingerbread house, attracting the Hansel and Gretel kind of thing. They get to eventually just take all VMware's customers, because who wouldn't want to finally migrate away from the VMware platform?
Right, or I'm sure VMware sees it as an opportunity to buy time while they finalize how they are going to add value in the space in the public cloud world that we're headed toward.
And our final news story for tonight is Amazon Deep Racer virtual circuit is now open. So if you've been working on trying to get your Deep Racer trained up to try to go win those big prizes, you can now do that virtually in the new Deep Racer console. You can build, train, and evaluate your reinforcement learning models online and compete online for some prizes. They will be adding a new track each month to make it interesting and to keep it competitive. And they're taking inspiration from racetracks around the globe. Each month, the top entrant in the leaderboard will get an expenses-paid trip to reInvent 2019, where they'll take place in the league knockout rounds and have a chance to win the championship cup. This is now available in the U.S. East region only. I don't know if it's going to be extended out beyond that because it is just a training and education tool. It did launch with 6 new tracks, 5 new tracks. The reInvent 2018 track, of course, which was launched then. The new London Loop track, Bowtie track, the Oval track, AWS track, and a new straight track. This console is no charge, and if you're using it to start your training, you'll get 10 hours a month for both SageMaker and RoboMaker to help build your models as credits.
Cool.
I'll give it a shot when they add the Top Gear track.
Which one? The US Top Gear or the European Top
Gear?
The
original, yeah.
All right. Ian, is there a Deep Racer track in Sydney this week?
Absolutely. I think there's 2 in Sydney this week. I know a lot of the enterprises have even set up their own tracks within their banking lobbies or that sort of thing. So it's definitely something that particularly our region is very interested in. And I would be surprised if the top leaderboard wasn't knocked off and the next day or two.
Wow, that'd be pretty impressive. It's definitely going to get more competitive now. You can do all this training online and not wait for the summit. So, all right, Peter, let's go to the lightning round.
All right. Starting it off with AWS Single Sign-On, now offering certificate customization to support your corporate policies.
I mean, how do you have a single sign-on solution that doesn't support custom certificates to do auth to other services? Like, it seems like such a miss for an MVP that this is now, 6 months after the service launches, they're now releasing this.
Amazon EKS supports EC2 A1 instances as public preview. I'm guessing you might have something to say about that, though, Jonathan.
It's great. The more ARM, the better, really.
There you go.
Yeah. I wish they hadn't called it A1. I think they could maybe just earned a different name, or they shouldn't have confused it quite as much with the AMD Epic name convention, but whatever.
It is definitely confusing that the AMDs are lowercase a, but the ARMs are uppercase A. I don't quite understand that. I don't know that I want to add the complexity of EKS to my ARM deployments, but, so I'm sure someone out there wants to do this. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yep.
Announcing Azure backup support to move recovery service vaults.
What does this mean? I don't understand this.
You can move your recovery service vaults, like from one account to another or one region to another.
Okay.
DR seems like a good DR thing, right?
By the way, Ian, I don't know if you know, you can just chime in with something quippy or a single comment. This isn't really.
Yeah, you're right.
Talk about
I will. It's just not these ones.
See, it's not just me.
But no, I realized that Peter didn't really explain the rules to our guest,
sorry.
which put you at a disservice, and so I felt bad, and then that's why I jumped in. But if you really don't have anything, then that's fine.
Yeah, the rules are speak up, say something, and then at the end, if somebody said something funny, they get a point. Although only one person gets a point. Okay. You can now optimize performance using Azure Database for Postgres Recommendations.
The recommendation is move to SQL Server.
Oh, wow. Amazon RDS now supports per second billing.
I just don't understand this. RDS is one of those services I really don't think is short-lived down to the sub-minute. So this announcement just doesn't make any sense to me.
I have two thoughts on it. One is, do I have to pay for the 25 minutes it takes to stand up the RDS instance? And then number two, who's the poor guy?
Ding, ding, ding.
Who's the poor guy who had to negotiate with Oracle the licensing at a per second level? Like, that just sounds awful.
Does it support all of them?
So far, I believe it does.
You'd imagine that conversation in like the normal world would be pretty easy. It's like, hey, we're going to divide the number of seconds. We're going to divide the minutely cost by the number of seconds and be done with it.
But there's a 10-minute minimum charge when the instance is created, so maybe that's what they're using to cover the spin up time.
There you go. AWS Service Catalog announces tag updating.
Tag, you're it.
AWS specifies the IP address ranges for Amazon DynamoDB endpoints.
So I have a public service announcement to all my friends out there in the Amazon world. If you have chosen to take your application and you have decided that you'd like it to publicly talk to an endpoint of DynamoDB on the internet, I would really strongly look at your security practices and really take a hard look at yourself in the mirror and say, is that really what you want to do? Because I'm not sure it is. And I don't think it's a good idea to have IP addresses for DynamoDB endpoints on the internet that you're accessing from your apps on premise without a VPN in the middle. Just me. I'm just putting it out there. I don't recommend it.
But if you're going to, it's good to whitelist.
Not that it prevents anyone else from getting to it, but
fine.
Hey, you're whitelisted. It's fine.
Efficiently scale ML and other compute workloads on NVIDIA's T4 GPU, now generally available on Google's GCP.
Well, they're a leader in machine learning. They should have it GA'd.
Yeah.
Amazon have had this known as in the works for quite some time, saying they'll support 1 to 8 GPUs, but now they just have to play catch up with Google, especially with them pushing their Elastic Inference service, which allows them to map GPUs arbitrarily to instance types, but they definitely have to play catch up now.
Imagine how much it costs when they do something like this. The more regions they have, the more availability zones they have. It's like just adding one new type of GPU, or no, just the incremental cost to them. It must be phenomenal.
Or they're getting really good at it.
If only they could like virtualize the GPUs.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Serverless automation using PowerShell preview now for Azure Functions, right? PowerShell for your Azure Functions.
So it's in preview today. I guarantee it'll be GA in 2 weeks.
For sure. I do like that Amazon beat them to this, though, and now they had to do this because Amazon did it first.
Nice. DynamoDB Mapper now supports Amazon DynamoDB transactional API calls.
For all our Java friends, DynamoDB Mapper.
Yeah, I had to look that up, actually. I'm not a Java programmer.
I didn't actually know there was a Dynamo one, but there's a Mongo one, so it made sense to me there's a Dynamo one.
Well, there you go. And now you can tag Amazon DynamoDB tables when you create them and not wait until afterward.
This is so that you can support the tagging enforcement rules to be expected. We're going to have about another 152 of these announcements in the next couple of weeks, so I think.
Well, then we'll just, as we do for other things that are just repetitive, we just don't talk about it in Lightning Round.
Yep.
AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store introduces advanced parameters.
Until you look at what they mean by advanced parameters and you realize they're not advanced.
They're the same old parameters, just a tiny bit better.
Just a tiny bit
Just
better.
a little bit better. A little bit.
Just a little bit longer, really, is what they are. Is you can now do massively nested certificate chains if you really want to.
Speaking of Systems Manager, it also now supports use of Parameter Store at a higher API throughput.
I'm so happy with this. This has broken so many things when you have Parameter Store that's backing things like CloudFormation, and these low rate limits will just, once you hit this limit, you're in this irrecoverable state of everything breaking. So finally, they're just letting us pay for it and fix the issue.
Isn't it so simple? Just pay for your API calls. When did it become so difficult?
This was an interesting one that someone else I know kind of gave me their use case why they were super happy about this, which was that, if you were launching thousands and thousands of containers using Parameter Store, you wouldn't be able to get more than a few containers up before it basically would stop functioning. And I was like, oh, that is actually a pretty good reason to have this API limit increased.
For sure. Azure accelerates supercomputing in the cloud with their Cray cluster store. Got to be careful with that one.
I'm just excited that I can now, in pure Jurassic Park form, I can now use the Cray cluster store to map the DNA genome of a dinosaur.
Oh, nice.
Like the book. That's the only reason. Anytime I see Cray, I think Jurassic Park. That's all I ever think about.
I thought they disappeared, actually. I thought Cray was long gone.
Oh, no, they're still around. They, I don't know that they're as big as they used to be because all of the open source HPC solutions off of Linux boxes kind of killed their mojo, but they're still ticking around out there in some places.
I remember I wrote to them, probably like in the mid 80s maybe, and I said, hey, can you send me some promotional pictures and things? Because, kind of like computers back then, I was kind of young. And their supercomputers, they look really nice. They got flashy lights and, seats to sit on and all that kind of thing. And they sent me a truckload of posters that were so big I could barely fit them in my bedroom. Like the kind of thing the kind of stuff that you put on the side of a bus stop or that kind of thing. It's really, really awesome.
I remember the first one I ever saw in person was, I think, at Epcot and in Florida, and it was a Cray supercomputer, and it used some type of water cooling that they basically piped out the front to make it look like a waterfall cascading down the front of the server. It was kind of cool. But I have a really soft spot for them. Like I mentioned, the Jurassic Park was a big book for me as a kid. It really got me kind of started interested in computing. So I have a soft spot for Cray. So I'm glad to see they're doing something, but I don't know what I would use it for. Wait
for 30 years from now when nobody knows how to use Cray and there's still like 25% of the huge banks or someone are still using it. They're gonna have a boon out of support replacement parts.
It makes you wonder that Azure is willing to support Cray. Will they be the first cloud provider to have a mainframe as a service?
Oh my God, they've had a mainframe as a service for like 30 years. It's called a what's it called? A bureau service? Yeah. Anyway, that is one of IBM's main services.
Will Hyperscaler do it? That's the bigger question that I can call with an API.
There you go.
Interesting.
That'll be cool. Schedule your time on the mainframe.
All right, we've gone to slow lightning again. So
AWS Security Token Service now supports enabling the global STS endpoint to issue session tokens compatible with all AWS regions.
It was so annoying to have to go get an STS token per region. If you're trying to do like test DR, different things, this simplifies a lot of use cases if you're using STS.
So now if somebody steals one of your tokens, now they can spin up your Bitcoin miners in every region instead of just one.
They only last for 8 hours at max.
So an awful lot of Bitcoins you can mine in 8 hours.
Well, that's true. But, they could do it the old way, too, and get one region. So
I just see more convenience 99.9% of the time, and 0.1% of the time, more single points of failure.
I wish there was more visibility into the temporary tokens that get issued. Like you could go to a console and list all the tokens that were currently active and currently issued, and when they were going to expire. Because right now somebody can issue a token, and you have no idea. And the only way it's pretty difficult to stop them from working once they've been issued.
It's worth noting that they still recommend to use the regional STS endpoints for latency reasons. I think a lot of people will just ignore that advice though.
Yeah,
probably.
Well, I definitely wouldn't use it for my apps, but I think for my use case, what I need to do, I would just use the global one because I don't care if it takes an extra couple seconds.
Let's finish up the lightning round. AWS Elastic Fabric Adapter is now GA. All right, SQL Server wins it, Justin.
Awesome.
Good
yes,
job.
victory is mine. All right, let's go on to the main event.
All right, so today for Cool Tools, we have Ian Mackay. We previously talked about his... what did we talk about before?
Console recorder.
That's right. We previously talked about the console recorder, and he's here in person on the show today to talk about his new tool, Forma 2. So over to you, Ian.
So console recorder came out, I think, in episode 5 for you guys, and you guys talked about it, and I got a lot of great feedback from you, and I got a lot of good feedback from the community around it as well. It's a really interesting experiment into new ways of doing infrastructure as code. One of the big pieces of feedback that I got is that their other developers aren't using the recorder, or they forget to record, or they're doing lots of different iterations on it. They just don't want to record every single thing. So can you do this for existing resources? And because of the way console recorder worked, where it was recording your network traffic, that was just not a thing. It was a purely passive tool. So I started to look into what things were out there, and the AWS CloudFormation tool was out there, and it was made back in 2011. And I had to look at it again, and it doesn't seem like it's changed one single bit.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah, it still outputs
because no one used it.
Yeah, that's true. Still outputs in JSON. It still requires an instance spun up in your account, and yeah, it's a very depressing thing. So I decided that I'll jump in and make this new product called Forma 2. And what Forma 2 does, it allows you to select from the existing resources in your account, and it runs completely in the browser and uses the API endpoints just to query it through the JavaScript SDK. So right now it supports 100% of the CloudFormation types, minus a couple of exceptions. Same for Troposphere and the CDK primitives, and about halfway through doing the Terraform types as well. Has a lot of cool features. It has the intrinsic function support, so it can ref or get attributed or sub from previous selected resources in the template. And you can search the entire account by keyword as well. So if you scan the entire account and you just say, I want my dev app or something similar to that, I can select from all of them and add it directly into a template.
Very cool. We had to play with it. Yeah, it's awesome. You must put a lot of work into that.
Yeah, I think console recorder took me about 4 months to do, because every single API call, every single transaction is manually mapped. Doing it again, I halved that time. I got this done in 2 months.
Nice.
You get a lot of lessons learned from the original time you do this. So, yeah, and it's fun. It's a much more traditional way of doing it. Like the SDK's calls don't change, but the console changes all the time. So it feels like a much more stable way of doing it.
I love the output. I used CloudFormation was like the first thing I did when I started using AWS and wanted to learn about CloudFormation, and it was so painful, both to use it as well as I didn't like the output it gave. And this I could imagine using almost as simply a shortcut to learning and prepping, even if I'm writing my own stuff from scratch. Almost like a super quick templater. I love the output. And the interface is so fast. Everything just works really smooth. I love it.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. The original CloudForm was horrendous. Even if you just had a few resources in your account, it's like they deliberately obfuscated the output. The resource names were just crazy. And this is really, really nice. And I totally agree. I would almost be tempted to start using the console to create things, do things, just so I could not have to type HCL or CloudFormation manually. So what would be involved in like adding extra output support for this? Like, do you have some kind of like internal model of these resources?
Every single resource comes out as a track resource, and that can have a bunch of internal identifiers and sort of a property map of each individual one. So what the property map is for CloudFormation is obviously not the one for Terraform, but I can just add these as we go. And it's similar to the same way we did console recorder as well. Same thing for the return values as well. So the ref and the get attribute identifiers are all different as well. So they have their own individual maps.
What's next?
Oh, God. I think one of the biggest issues I had with this, and I was very surprised by it, is this cause problem. You'll notice if you start to use Forma 2, one of the first things it does is to prompt you to install this small browser extension. And the reason for that is that more than 50% of the service endpoints in Amazon, so that's like S3.AWS or things like that, doesn't actually have cause support. So natively, a website cannot call out to the service endpoints and be allowed to do that within a browser context. And I was super surprised by this, so I had to create this sort of browser extension to bypass that limitation, which is unfortunate because I did want this to have a native experience. You can use it without the browser extension, you're just not going to have the full service coverage. And there's important ones in there like S3 and IAM that just doesn't have that support.
How bizarre, like the irony of S3 not having, probably one of the biggest web servers in the world, not supporting cores.
Yes, it's insane.
Yeah, well, at least the API for it not supporting cores. Yeah, it seems
and
kind of
the big problem with this is that because each service team is individual, if you want to fix this problem, you have to raise 100 PFRs or service requests.
And then try to get them prioritized by the product management and everything else. So good luck to you on that.
Yeah. So we should get everybody listening to raise a PFR.
Yeah, one each.
Yep.
Oh, God.
What made you choose CloudFormation, Terraform, and Troposphere? I mean, CloudFormation is kind of obvious, but why Terraform and Troposphere? And have you had requests for others at this point?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to gauge the market as for which DSLs are most popular. Like, I think CloudFormation is definitely first, and Terraform is definitely second at this point, although people would argue that one. Terraform has had a massive boost, in my opinion, in the last 12 months, just because of their resource coverage and the flexibility of their DSL. Troposphere has always been around, and I think it's less used, but it's one of those more, I guess, easier to map outputs as well. And CDK support for the TypeScript CloudFormation primitives is in here as well. I just don't advertise that fact because it's really, it's pretty fresh, so I'm not fully tested with it yet, but it should work.
It'd be interesting to see if you could, start using this for like whatever Azure's language is and Google's language, whatever their version of CloudFormation is, which I don't know the name on top of my head, but it'd be interesting to see, kind of like, oh, here's how you do it in EC2 versus how you do it in Azure. I can see that being kind of interesting too. But
yeah, I've had a couple of requests for that. It's because of how hard it is just to do one. It's to do another two on top of that is a huge challenge, and I think they already have some tooling around it. One of the feedbacks that the community came back with on console recorder is that Azure and Google have been doing this, perform this action as a code in their console forever, and Amazon has never done it. So they always had that advantage of, I just perform this action. By the way, here is your CLI call or SDK call to do that same thing, and Amazon's never had that. But this is something a bit different. This is scanning your account for existing resources and then generating the the infrastructure as code for that.
I can see this getting a lot of people, who are trying to move to Terraform or trying to move to CloudFormation. Like, this is a nice quick start. Like, here's how it works. And
there's quite a few use cases around, like people that have started in the console and now moving into infrastructure as code, getting that easy migration path in is really good. And like you said, it's a really good education tool as well.
Do you see this as becoming something you're going to do full time in the future, or is there a team already that's working with you to do this, or what's kind of your thoughts on how do you keep this maintained over time? Because I think that was one of our comments about the console recorder is, it's really great and it's awesome, but do you have the motivation as a single person to continue to modify it as they add new services? And that's always the risk of any of these type of tools is, how do you continue to maintain them as Amazon, launches another 35 services at reInvent next year?
It's always a bit of a challenge. I think Forma 2 is significantly easier to maintain because there is well-documented SDK calls that can associate with this. And to get this far in a relatively short amount of time and to keep up with a few resources being added is not too hard in my opinion. My question is going to be how can I maintain console recorder, which can have a lot of arbitrary stuff in the request that I need to figure out what that means, like reverse engineering Google Web Toolkit's wire request. But this is something I'm doing in my spare time. I've got no one else actually working on it, but there are a couple helpful community members that have done a couple of pull requests and issue raising, and I do appreciate that a lot.
You open source Forma 2 or just console recorder?
Yeah, both of them are open source. Both of them are on GitHub. Console recorder being an extension, you can just run it and download it and modify it as you need to. Forma 2 was also designed in that way, so you can clone the repo, host it locally, and run that as that is, which should alleviate a lot of the security questions that people ask.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, if you'd had people complaining about pasting tokens in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the top comments every time we talk about this sort of thing. So it's about as good as I'm going to get regarding the security issues behind it, is that I can have it such that you can host it locally and inspect the code, and you can determine for yourself whether you want to use the service or not, even locally.
How's it deployed right now? I assume it's running in AWS.
Yeah. When I demo this, I actually use Forma 2 to show off how I could CloudFormation my Forma 2 resources. So that's an interesting piece of dog fooding. But yeah,
awesome.
it's basically just S3 bucket with an OAI to CloudFront. So it's pretty simple stuff.
What can our listeners do to help you other than making pull requests, and is there anything else you need to get this kind of going? Is something bigger?
All the feedback and all the feature requests are the best thing I can possibly get at the moment. Any bug reports and that sort of thing is something that is super helpful. I had a request to add GovCloud yesterday, which I could quickly add, but it's just one of those things that I can't actually test because I don't have access to that region. So I can add it, but you got to test it for me. So it's just that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. And, I find it funny because I think many years ago I talked to someone at AWS about Forma and how garbage it was, and are they doing anything to make it better? And they make it sound like it's this really super complicated thing to do, and you just showed them that you can do it.
Yeah, I know that when Forma 2 was out, there's a lot of talk internally about how this was created and what can they do internally. I heard from developer advocates that there were internal projects to do similar sort of things, but it just never got off the ground. Well,
I think that wraps up today's episode. How do they follow you on the internet, Ian, if they want to reach out to you on Twitter and thank you for the tool? Or I know they can go to your GitHub and put an issue in if there's a bug.
Yep, so I'm on Twitter. The username is IANN0036. Same thing for GitHub. And those are the two platforms I'm usually on. But yeah, any pull requests, any bug requests, or even just hit me up on Twitter, and all that is very much appreciated.
Fantastic. We're definitely going to be playing with this a lot. Really awesome tool, and I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk to us about it, and happy to support your launch of Forma 2. Nice work. And that is the Week in Cloud. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Foghorn Consulting. Subscribe today on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and tweet us your feedback at #TheCloudPod.